In 1305, Scotland, a young man, grew up in the shadow of the mountains and along the banks of rushing rivers. His name was William Wallace. The sky was draped in gray clouds and cold winds howled through the stone streets of villages, letting the people feel the weight of oppression. The English occupation left deep wounds, not only on the lands, but on the very spirits of the people. In this harsh environment, Wallace, who appeared to be an ordinary peasant, carried within him a courage and a thirst for justice that would soon make him the beacon of hope for his people. Having lost his family at a young age, he became acquainted with pain and loss early on. These experiences left deep marks on his character and fueled his growing desire for justice and freedom. Wallace grew up in the rugged landscapes of Scotland. The mountains, dense forests, and fast-flowing rivers shaped him into both physically resilient and strategically sharp. At an early age, he began to show leadership qualities among the villagers around him. People admired his bravery, trusted his determination, and gradually began to respect him. Wallace's intelligence and quick thinking set him apart from ordinary peasants. He learned early that battles were won not only with strength, but with cunning and strategy. During this time, Scotland groaned under English oppression. Royal officials exercised all forms of violence and control to crush the people as spirit of freedom. Heavy taxes, forced military service, constant inspections in villages and towns. Life for the common people was under threat every single day. In this environment, Wallace began to think not only of his own safety, but also of the freedom of his people. His early acts of resistance were small-scale raids, sabotage, and organized defiance against English forces. These actions strengthened his reputation among the people and made him appear as a dangerous force to the English. Wallace's personality lay at the core of his leadership. Courage, intelligence, and strategic thinking were the fundamental traits that transformed him from an ordinary man into a living legend. His composure in the face of enemies inspired his people and struck fear into the hearts of the English. Wallace stood out not only for his physical strength, but also for his ability to organize people and unite them around a purpose. What began as resistance in small villages soon spread across Scotland. The young hero's rise was further fueled by the faith and hope of the people. Every victory, whether against a small English garrison in a village or in capturing a major strategic point, reminded the Scottish people that freedom was possible. Villagers shared his stories, sang songs of his deeds, and through Wallace's resistance found their own courage. He was no longer just a fighter. In the eyes of his people, he had become the living symbol of freedom. However, this rise inevitably brought conflict. The English saw Wallace as a threat and devised plans to diminish his influence over the people. Wallace was no longer fighting solely in the Scottish hills. He was also contending with the enemy's political and psychological tactics. The people rallied around him, following his leadership, and with every move he made, he became the embodiment of the struggle for freedom. This period marked the beginning of Wallace's journey from ordinary man to legendary figure. The hopes of the people merged with his courage and determination, igniting the flame of freedom across Scotland. Even at a young age, Wallace learned to balance his own life with the destiny of his nation, aiming to overcome the enemy through courage and strategy. This chapter immerses the viewer in Wallace's rise as both a man and a leader, detailing his first acts of defiance, his character, the influence he held over the people, and his relentless fight for freedom. William Wallace had become a symbol of freedom and resistance across all of Scotland. From small villages to castles, from towns to the streets of cities, his name traveled in whispers, and his courage was passed from mouth to mouth. Yet this rise carried deadly dangers. The English throne saw Wallace as a threat, and had long been planning to neutralize him. King Edward I aimed to capture Wallace and make an example of him, executing him in front of both the English public and the Scottish villagers. Wallace had become more than just a warrior. he had become a symbolic threat to the English. His capture came through betrayal and ambush. Lured into a trap by some he trusted, the young hero fell into the hands of English soldiers at a carefully planned location. Bound in chains and seemingly powerless, Wallace still carried the hope of his people deep within. For the English, this was not merely a capture, it was a psychological victory and a propaganda opportunity. This display of captivity before the eyes of the people was meant to crush the spirit of resistance. The journey as a prisoner became both a physical and psychological torment for Wallace. Shackled and tied to horses or carts, he was frequently mocked by the English soldiers, subjected to insults and threats meant to break his morale. Along the way, crowds in the villages and towns he passed through watched him with a mix of fear, curiosity, and admiration. His gaze, despite the chains, remained defiant and courageous. In the eyes of the people, he was still a leader and a symbol of freedom. Throughout the journey, the English tried to wear Wallace down both physically and mentally. They left him hungry and exhausted, paraded him in chains, and jeered at him openly before the people. Yet Wallace maintained his inner discipline, never letting go of the hope for his nation's freedom. Every step he took symbolized resistance and created opportunities to undermine the enemy's plans. Upon reaching London, the atmosphere that greeted Wallace was cold and threatening. As he walked toward Westminster, every stone wall, every soldier, and every gaze tested his courage. When brought before the court, bound in chains, he did not lose his upright posture or defiant stare. The judges and royal officials applied every psychological pressure to intimidate him and turn him into a cautionary figure in the eyes of the public. Yet Wallace, despite all of the enemy's games, continued to embody the symbol of resistance through his strategic mind. Even during his captivity, the reactions of the people were closely observed. In the towns and villages he passed through, people silently or quietly expressed their support, acknowledging his courage with small gestures. Everyone could see how powerful and symbolic a man in chains could still be in the eyes of the people. Wallace's journey as a prisoner demonstrated that he was not only physically restrained but also a critical figure for the support of the people and the continuation of the resistance. Chains could bind Wallace's body, but they could not imprison his spirit. In every town and village along the way, his resistance was witnessed. Against the enemy's mockery and threats, Wallace displayed a quiet defiance, remaining a hero and a symbol of freedom in the eyes of the people. Every pain, insult, and act of ridicule during the journey only strengthened his resolve. For even in captivity, Wallace continued to be an integral part of his people's struggle for freedom. William Wallace was marched through the cold stone walls of Westminster, bound in chains. As he passed through the streets of London, the gazes of the people shifted between fear, curiosity, and admiration. His upright posture and defiant stare revealed courage and determination, even though his body was shackled. The English soldiers tried every method to break his spirit. At every step, they subjected him to mockery, insults, and physical hardship. When he was brought into the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with intimidation and authority. In the stone-floored halls of Westminster, heavy shadows on the walls and the royal insignias cast a psychological weight over Wallace. The judges were arranged in strict alignment with King Edward I's plan. This trial was not meant to deliver justice. It was designed to create a cautionary figure in the eyes of the people. Yet Wallace, despite his chains, stood tall, fixing his eyes on the court with quiet but unwavering resolve. From the very start of the trial, Wallace's right to defend himself was severely limited. The court swiftly enumerated the charges, labeling his resistance as rebellion and treason. English officials employed every psychological tactic to break him. Threats, subtle mockery, and harsh accusations came one after another. But Wallace chose his words carefully, never forgetting that he represented the hope of his people's freedom. Throughout the trial, Wallace faced not just the role of a criminal, but that of a leader and a symbol of liberty, standing against oppression. Each accusation tested his strategic mind and courage. In the eyes of the people, he remained a hero. Bound in chains, his stance continued to symbolize a living resistance. The silence of the courtroom was tense, not only for the English officials, but for all who had come to witness the strength of his will. Physical and psychological tactics continued throughout the proceedings. Shackled and constantly under surveillance, Wallace was subjected to small insults and threats intended to break his morale. Yet he remained calm, and with every glance he influenced both the judges and the spectators in the room. The responsibility he carried as a symbol of his people's resistance seemed to transcend the physical chains that bound him. Wallace's trial was also a major propaganda opportunity for the English. Every corner of the courtroom had been arranged to display royal power and authority. Yet even on this stage, Wallace continued to embody freedom in the eyes of the people. The chains restrained his body, but they could not claim his spirit. As the trial progressed, Wallace's strategic mind quietly but effectively revealed itself. Every response he gave to the English officials reinforced his leadership and bravery in the eyes of the people. He stood tall in the courtroom as a figure representing his nation's hope, maintaining fearlessness despite captivity and threats. This process at Westminster was not merely a personal trial for Wallace. It represented the strength of the Scottish freedom movement and the resilience of its people. Every moment in the courtroom strengthened the public's trust in him and, in a sense, undermined the English plan. Wallace's stance, bound in chains, became a scene that symbolized the very spirit of liberty. The days William Wallace spent in Westminster were for the English both a preparation for triumph and a calculated display of intimidation. King Edward I intended to punish Wallace in a manner that would serve as a public warning, aiming to shatter the symbol of resistance in Scotland. Every detail of the execution had been meticulously planned. The execution site, the placement of spectators, the positioning of soldiers, and even the angles from which the crowd would view it. Wallace may not have known all the specifics of the plan, but with his keen observation and intelligence, he sensed the danger approaching. During his captivity, Wallace faced constant physical and psychological trials. The chains restricted his movements, and the relentless surveillance and subtle mockery by English soldiers tested his morale. Yet he never relinquished the role of leader in the eyes of his people. Every glance, every silent gesture reinforced the faith the public had in him. While the English sought to break his spirit, Wallace, even in chains, continued to display courage and resistance. On the day of the execution, Westminster was a scene of intense preparation. Crowds had gathered, orchestrated to witness and absorb the demonstration of royal power. When Wallace was brought to the execution site, bound in chains, a tense silence enveloped the area. At every step he felt the gaze of the people upon him, some fearful, some awed, and others mourning. Even shackled, Wallace stood tall, defying the English attempts to intimidate him. The English had meticulously planned the methods of execution to serve as symbols of terror. Brutal procedures such as castration, dismemberment, and hanging were meant not only to punish the body, but to send a stark warning to the populace. Wallace, aware of the death that awaited him, chose to face his final moments with unwavering courage. As a warrior, he sought to demonstrate that not only his body, but also his will remained free. Before the execution, Wallace carefully observed the movements of soldiers and officials. Every detail was a reflection of his intellect and strategic perspective. In front of the public, he maintained his brave stance despite the fear of death, largely nullifying the intended effect of English propaganda. His resistance, even on the brink of death, uplifted the morale of the people and further cemented his status as a symbol of the struggle for freedom. Throughout the preparations, Wallace's mental fortitude was rigorously tested. The English sought not only to bind him physically but to break him psychologically. Yet, through his silence and posture, he suppressed his own fears and continued to serve as a living example of courage to the public. Chains, execution tools, and the intimidating surroundings could not conquer his spirit. As he was brought to the execution site, Wallace's mind reflected on his past victories and the memories of the struggle for freedom. Each triumph, each strategic maneuver had cemented his reputation and courage in the eyes of the people. Even at the threshold of death, Wallace was not merely a man in physical captivity. He stood tall as a figure, embodying the hope of his nation. As the sun slowly rose over Westminster, preparations for Wallace's execution were complete. The silence of the crowd and the soldiers carried the weight of the impending pain. William Wallace, bound in chains, was brought to the execution site, where the atmosphere was tense and foreboding. English soldiers controlled every step, monitored every movement, and sought to send a terrifying message to the spectators. Yet Wallace stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his courage and will still intact. As the execution began, the brutal plan was set in motion. Wallace was to be punished by methods meticulously designed by the English: castration, dismemberment by the rack, and ultimately, hanging. Each step represented not only physical agony but also psychological terror and a cautionary display to the people. Despite the lethal ordeal, Wallace maintained his silence, revealing no fear. Though chains and instruments of death bound his body, they could not conquer his spirit. The English intended for Wallace's presence at the execution to have a profound effect on the onlookers. Yet his final resistance shattered their plans. With every wave of pain and every moment of torture, Wallace stood tall, displaying unyielding courage. Witnessing this defiance, the people saw not just an execution, but the forging of a legend. Throughout the ordeal, Wallace experienced every moment consciously. Despite the excruciating pain, he observed every move of the English soldiers, cataloging their actions in his mind, and continued to embody a symbol of bravery in the eyes of the public. The clatter of chains and instruments filled the execution ground, yet his gaze shone like a beacon of hope. Even on the brink of death, the spirit of resistance within him remained alive, and even stronger. Wallace's execution was not merely the end of a man's life. It became a symbolic scene for the struggle of a people seeking freedom. The English intended to turn his death into a warning, but Wallace's steadfast courage kept the flame of liberty alive in the hearts of the people. Every cry of pain, every moment of torture, only served to amplify his legend. In the final stages, the physical violence inflicted upon Wallace reached its peak. Castration and dismemberment transformed the scene into one of unimaginable agony and horror, leaving even spectators breathless. Yet Wallace never relinquished his courage. His eyes met those of the crowd, his spirit free and unbroken. On the threshold of death, his determination and defiance transformed him from a mere mortal into a legend. Though his chains were broken and his body destroyed, Wallace's spirit and struggle represented the beginning of a legend that would spread across Scotland. The people would tell of his courage and sacrifice, and his story would live on for generations as a symbol of the fight for freedom. After William Wallace's brutal execution at Westminster, a quiet wave of sorrow spread across Scotland. The people did not feel that a hero had been destroyed before their eyes with chains and instruments of torture. Rather, they felt the loss of a symbol of resistance. Yet, Wallace's courage and determination did not vanish with his death. On the contrary, they grew even stronger in the minds and hearts of the people. As news of his death reached the villages and towns of Scotland, activity and resolve began to stir among the populace. Wallace's deeds and sacrifices inspired ordinary villagers to become small leaders and strategic thinkers. The resistance began to continue independently of Wallace's physical presence. Every village told his story, passing on the spirit of courage and freedom to the younger generations. Scottish military leaders studied Wallace's strategic maneuvers and applied his tactics in their own struggles. Small-scale attacks, raids on castles, and acts of sabotage became a continuation of the examples Wallace had set in his early years of resistance. The people used his bravery and determination as a guide to organize their own actions. Wallace's legacy extended beyond the battlefield, influencing social and cultural life as well. His stories spread among the people through songs, epics, and oral traditions, keeping the spirit of resistance alive in the minds of both young and old. The people saw in Wallace's life that the fight for freedom was not only a physical battle, but also a struggle of faith and will. Even after his death, the Scottish people did not lose courage in the face of English intimidation. Wallace's example became a source of motivation for the leaders and villagers organizing the resistance. The movement no longer depended on individual heroes. Wallace's legacy lived on in the collective memory and shared resolve of the people. His story shaped Scotland's struggle for freedom throughout history. While his death may have seemed like a loss in the short term, in the long run it brought the people together, encouraged new leaders to emerge, and strengthened the resistance. Wallace endured not only as a warrior, but as an idea and a symbol of defiance. In the eyes of the people, Wallace was a hero who could not be constrained by chains or execution devices. In every village and every town, his courage was spoken of, and his sacrifice was recounted for generations. His death did not extinguish Scotland's fight for freedom. Instead, it became a spark that ignited the determination and resilience of the people. Even years after William Wallace's death, his name and struggle continued to live vividly in the memory of the Scottish people. His courage and fight for freedom inspired not only those who lived during his time, but also generations that followed. Wallace had transcended his physical existence, becoming a legend in the minds and hearts of the people. Oral histories and folk narratives passed down Wallace's life and resistance through the generations. In towns and villages, children grew up listening to stories about him. His tactics, bold maneuvers, and steadfastness in the face of the enemy were recounted through songs and epic tales. Each retelling made him not merely a warrior, but a living symbol of the struggle for liberty. Historians began to examine Wallace's strategic intelligence and leadership abilities in detail. Chronicles, English records, and Scottish epics documented not only his courage, but also the profound influence he had over the people. Subsequent battles were planned based on the strategies he had employed. Scotland's fight for freedom nurtured new leaders and maintained organized resistance through the legacy of Wallace. Literature and cultural works immortalized Wallace as a legend. Poems, plays, and later historical texts told his story, instilling courage, determination, and a desire for freedom in younger generations. Even after his death, Wallace persisted in Scotland's collective memory, and his name became a symbol of liberty and resistance. Wallace's legend extended beyond Scotland. Across Europe, he was recognized as an inspiring figure in the fight for freedom. His courage and sacrifice were recorded by historians of other nations and cited as examples of heroism. Over time, Wallace's struggle became a central subject in history books and academic studies. In the eyes of the people, Wallace was a hero who could not be restrained by chains or execution devices. His death ended his physical presence, but immortalized the idea of freedom and resistance. Each new generation grew up hearing his story, remembering him as a symbol of courage, defiance, and the enduring pursuit of liberty. Throughout history, Wallace's name has been celebrated as a symbol of freedom struggles and popular resistance. His legend remained alive across Scotland's landscape, its culture, and its historical records. Wallace had become not just a figure of the past, but a universal emblem of freedom itself. After William Wallace's execution at Westminster, a void spread through the hearts of the Scottish people. But this void was not solely filled with sorrow. Wallace's courage and resistance continued to burn like an undying flame in the eyes of the people. His death did not end the struggle. Instead, it galvanized the Scots to act against the English with greater organization and determination. In the early years, small-scale attacks and guerrilla tactics were carried out by leaders who followed the strategic legacy Wallace had left behind. Scottish villagers targeted castles, bridges, and roads, disrupting English supply lines. The methods Wallace had developed during his campaigns remained effective tools on the battlefield, even after his death. Among the rising leaders of this period was Robert the Bruce. This new generation of leaders, inspired by Wallace, gained the support of the people and began to build larger, more organized armies. Wallace's courage and strategic insight shaped the tactics of Robert the Bruce and other resistance leaders. The English soon realized that they were no longer facing lone heroes, but a collectively organized resistance. The Scottish people, fueled by Wallace's example, rose against the English with renewed determination. Towns and villages became not only battle sites but also centers of resistance planning. Wallace's stories motivated young warriors and maintained high morale among the people. Every attack served as a reminder of his legacy and reinforced the belief in freedom. Although the English sought to turn Wallace's absence to their advantage, the resistance no longer depended on individual heroes. Wallace's strategic vision, combined with the people's loyalty to him, had created a collective spirit of defiance throughout Scotland. From small villages to grand castles, the people united against the English, keeping Wallace's ideals of freedom alive. The wars that followed Wallace's death were not only military campaigns, but also a testament to the strengthening consciousness of the people's desire for freedom. The resistance initiated by Wallace's pioneering tactics continued under new leaders and increasingly organized armies. Across Scotland, his name remained a symbol of defiance and liberty, and the people preserved his legacy. Over time, Scotland's struggle for freedom gained greater momentum following Wallace's death. The battles led by Robert the Bruce were seen as a continuation of Wallace's fight, solidifying the determination of the Scottish people against English oppression. Wallace's legacy became more than a memory of the past. It became a cornerstone of Scotland's spirit of resistance.